Hi, Lagim fam. I want to introduce to you a friend of the podcast. Well, friends, really. I am talking about With Nothing to Say, a podcast by two movie-loving friends. Here is their trailer.
I'm Austin Lugo.
I'm Andrew Harp.
This is With Nothing to Say. And let's talk about movies. With over 3,000 films log, Andrew and I, best friends since middle school, have dedicated our lives to watching, making, and talking about movies. Each week, Andrew and I handpick a movie he's seen, I've seen, or neither of us have seen, and dive deep into anything and everything two wannabe cinephiles could ever think of. From horror to dramedy, we do it all. So join us as we talk about everything movies, and maybe you too can become a bona fide cinephile.
So check them out after listening to this episode of Lagim and make sure to show them some Lagim fam love. Now, on to the show. I once tried explaining to a German friend what my late mother relayed to me about the martial law era. I jokingly, or maybe just half-jokingly shared that my mother nearly joined the CPP and PA movement because she too was disillusioned by the Marcos government. Life was hard, Mom would say, and she was tempted to take up arms and move to the mountains somewhere in Davao del Sur, but familial responsibilities stopped her. She also had a vision of becoming a mother to a daughter. So instead of going to the mountains, she escaped the Philippines in 1983 and landed in Germany, where she could work and provide for my grandparents back home in Davao del Sur. Funny how life turns out, she would say. She wanted to put some distance between herself and the ugliness taking place in her country, but she never downplayed what was going on during the Marcos regime. She was clear in her description of the atrocities. She knew which side she was on during those years of darkness, as she called it. I told my friend that my mother, despite her escape to Europe, always highlighted the efforts of the young people at that time. They were loud, outspoken, brave, strong-willed, educated, and fueled by love for their country. She admired them. So I always knew the importance the youth played in ousting the Marcoses from the Philippines, in the People's Power Revolution on EDSA, and in the reinstatement of democracy in the Philippines. Well, democracy in quotation marks, that is. Later on, when I was old enough to read and understand that part of my heritage, a lot of stories and a lot of people inspired me. Boyet Mijares, Eman Lacaba, Ishmael Quimpo Jr. Growing up, I was very aware that I had to be aware of both that era in Filipino history, the way that I am aware and educated about the Nazis as part of my German heritage. And that is why I want to pay respects to two inspiring young people who I have read about as a teenager. These are the cases of Liliosa Hilao and Archimedes Trajano. Mabuhay Lagim fam, welcome to a sort of double episode. I originally planned on separating these two cases, but since they are so similar in some respects, I thought it was better to put them together to create one big episode. I now need to think of a third episode for my martial law series, so if you have any suggestions, feel free to find the suggestion list on my Insta bio link and type in there cases that you think I should cover. If I do not get to them for this season, please know that I will feature martial law cases in every season from this moment on, so your suggestions will not be in vain. On a different note, please remember that I have a Patreon account where you can support me for $2 a month. In return, you will get early access to my regular episodes, and they will be ad-free as well. Supporting this independent podcast of mine is just about the greatest thing you can do to help me out, so I can continue making content for you, lovely listeners. You can also use the affiliate links in the show notes below if you choose to visit the companies they belong to. I've got links for Canva, Shopee, Lazada, and now Kiwi.com, a travel search engine. As always, please note that details in this case may be disturbing for some people, so please take care of yourself whilst listening. English novelist George Orwell once said that, quote, "Freedom of press, if it means anything at all, means the freedom to criticize and oppose." End of quote. Orwell wrote a whole dystopian science fiction novel to drive home that point and many others. His novel 1984 showed us that in authoritarian or totalitarian regimes, press freedom did not have a place at all. When Proclamation 1081 was made on the 21st of September 1972, Marcos placed the Philippines under martial law. With that, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus and the 1935 Constitution. He dissolved Congress and padlocked the Batasang Pambansa, the location of the Philippine legislature, and therefore assumed both legislative and executive powers. Even though the proclamation was made on the 21st, this document was already signed by the 17th. The announcement at that point was a mere formality. Now, what many probably may not know is that Marcos ordered his military allies to start apprehending and arresting his political opponents and to close down both retail and media outlets some 22 hours before the proclamation. He knew where to hit democracy where it really hurt. This did not, however, mean that those who believed in free press ceased their work. Now more than ever, they thought they were needed by the Filipinos. One young woman who felt the strong calling of protest by pen was Liliosa Hilao, fondly called Lily by her friends and family. Lily was born on the 14th of March 1950 in Bulan, current-day Sorsogon. She was the seventh of 9 children. As a child, she was precocious and always did well in school, both in grade and high school. When it was time to pick a college after high school, she enrolled at the Pamantasan ng Lungsod ng Maynila or University of the City of Manila, where she took up communication arts. Having a keen interest in journalism, she eventually became an associate editor for PLM's publication called Hasik, which is a Filipino verb that means to sow or scatter. She wore many hats in her extracurricular activities, keeping herself busy on top of her studies. She was part of the college's student government, and she was also her department's student president. She eventually became part of the College Editors Guild of the Philippines and was even the secretary for the women's club at her university. Lastly, she also was responsible for forming the Communication Arts Club at her university. I do not think there was any doubt at all as to what profession Lily was gunning for. She was dedicated to journalism and was not only a brilliant editor, but a persuasive writer as well. But Lily existed at a time when being a journalist was akin to being a terrorist, at least in the eyes of the Marcos regime. Nevertheless, she wrote. She wrote pieces that were hard-hitting with titles like The Vietnamization of the Philippines and Democracy is Dead in the Philippines under Martial Law. It was clear where she stood a year after martial law was declared in the Philippines. The irony of it all, however, was that Lily's untimely demise was not directly because of her work as a writer or an activist. As much as Lily wanted, she could not participate in most of the student protests taking place in Manila at that time. She was asthmatic and had to care for herself first and foremost. And whilst she may have eliminated that risk to her health by not participating in the protests, she could never have anticipated the events on the 4th of April 1973. I know there are summarized accounts out there of what happened, but I found one obscure article from 2004 about Lily's sister, Marie. She was directly quoted as she was giving her account of what happened that day. Speaking about the evening of the 4th of April 1973, Marie Hilao recalled the following.
I was at home meeting with students when 3 of Marcos's burly men barged in. They turned our files upside down. So we asked for their warrant. They just said, "It's martial law. We can do whatever we want." They demanded of me, "Where are your sisters? Where are your brothers and the others with whom you work?" So after eating our food, the one left to guard me, he laid down and dozed off. I was washing dishes that time, and I was so angry that they had slapped me. So I tested if he was asleep by moving the table. When the guard didn't wake up, I jumped the fence into my neighbor's house. The guards had taken my glasses, so I was running away without being able to see. I warned my sisters, Liliosa and Josefina, not to go home. But Liliosa was afraid and worried about our mother, who was sick. So she went home and was arrested and tortured.
On the evening of the 4th of April 1973, 3 members of the Philippine Constabulary, identifying themselves as part of the anti-narcotics unit, raided the Hilao residence. They were soldiers and they were drunk. The man who identified himself as their leader was someone named Lieutenant Arturo Castillo. Castillo and the other soldiers, as Marie recalled already, demanded to see the Hilao children and anyone else who the soldiers deemed as working with them. They demanded access to the home, even though they did not carry with them any search or arrest warrant. Lily was not actually in when the soldiers first arrived. She arrived later, and when she did, she demanded to see a search warrant. She knew her rights, but as we have heard from Marie's account already, she was met with violence instead. It started with a slap after Lily asked for that warrant and devolved into pure brutality. Lieutenant Castillo, according to an official letter later released by the Hilao family, beat her up repeatedly. Those who were present at the Hilao residence at that point tried to stop Castillo from beating young Lily, but they too were threatened with violence by Castillo and the other soldiers. And then, just like that, the soldiers took Lily away, handcuffing her and dragging her from her family home. The soldiers said she needed to be taken in for questioning, but I guess we all know now that during those times, questioning had become a euphemism for torture. No one can really be sure what exactly was done to Lily, but there are 2 short accounts to give us a glimpse as to how bad it was for Lily in the days after her arrest and detention at Camp Crame. Josefina Hilao, her sister, was also arrested. She was taken to Camp Crame just like Lily was. Josefina would later say that although she saw her beloved sister, she was not allowed to talk to her. She remembered how parts of Lily's face were badly beaten and bloodied, indication of prolonged and constant torture and abuse. Another person who saw Lily was her own brother-in-law. He was part of the army, as it were, and he too reported that Lily was in a bad way, that her face was swollen, and that there were clear signs of torture. The Hilao family lived in agony and fear for almost 3 days after Lily was taken. On the 7th of April, they received a call. Specifically, Alice Hilao Gualberto, another sister of Lily's, was the one who picked up the phone. According to the caller, Lily was at that point confined in a hospital on Camp Crame and was in critical condition due to serious injuries. Alice made her way to Camp Crame, and upon being permitted to see her sister, she immediately noticed the many injuries sustained by Lily. Her face was barely recognizable. It was swollen and disfigured. Her lips were full of cigarette burns. She had several injection marks on her arms and injuries sustained from handcuffs. She also noticed that there was some sort of opening in her throat area. Alice would later recount that no one was tending to her sister. Neither nurse nor doctor was around to look after her. The medical equipment on site did not seem to be working either. The family would also later state in the letter that I have mentioned that the room Lily was in smelled strongly of formalin or formaldehyde. Distraught at what she saw, Alice was naturally worried, but before she could do anything, she was dragged away by personnel at Kamkrame into the anti-narcotic unit's office. Josefina, her other sister, was already there. Now, it's not clear how long the sisters were held up there, but enough time must have passed because at some point, Arturo Castillo, the same soldier who first slapped and then beat up Lily some 3 days ago, informed the Hilao sisters that Lily had died. The Hilao family was devastated. Losing Lily was painful enough, but this pain was only exacerbated by the brazen actions of the Philippine constabulary after Lily had died. The official line when commenting about Lily's death was that Lily attempted suicide by drinking muriatic acid, another name for hydrochloric acid, a substance that is highly corrosive and obviously poisonous. Their findings apparently showed that Lily, as a result of her suicide attempt, ultimately died of a cardiorespiratory arrest. The constabulary then gave the Hilao family 2,200 pesos for burial expenses, an amount that was vehemently refused by the family. Now, I'm not sure if the following was found during a separate post-mortem examination of Lily's body, or if this was from the same necropsy report prepared by the Philippine Constabulary. In this report about Lily's death, her torso was observed to have sustained major bruising with finger and hand and gun marks still visible. There was also a suspicion that Lily was sexually abused, something that would not be far-fetched or surprising. In the sources I have used in my research for this episode, it seems implied that the throat injury Alice saw on her sister was indeed from an ingestion of muriatic acid, but this was not Lily's doing. The acid, it seems so implied, was forced down her throat, leading to her death. If this was indeed how she was murdered, then I think it does not take a lot of imagination to see that this was a very painful death. A painful death that was already preceded by horrific torture and abuse. Following her death, Lily would soon be known as the first female martial law detainee who died in prison, a mere 6, almost 7 months after Proclamation 1081.
In 1986, violence in the streets, accusations of cheating, and the dodgy human rights record led Marcos to call for a snap election. To the surprise of many in the Philippines and around the world, he lost to the late Senator Aquino's widow, Cory, a defeat Marcos was not willing to accept.
The final hours of Ferdinand Marcos at the presidential palace in Manila. Thousands of loyalists cheering the failing dictator who was soon to be told by his American friends to cut and run. Scenes faithfully preserved by his personal camera crews, as they'd done countless times before. When Marcos fled, the palace tapes remained behind, an intriguing and potentially incriminating collection. Hundreds of hours of recorded history broadcast to glorify the deposed dictator. Hundreds more hours of private tapes yet to be seen or analyzed by the new government.
When the Marcoses were ousted in 1986, the Hilao family, along with other families, sued the Marcoses for the torture of their loved ones in a court in Hawaii. The aim was to get compensation for 9,539 Filipinos who were all human rights abuse victims. The case was the first one of its kind to be tried in a U.S. court. Initially, the case was dismissed, with the court saying that a head of state had immunity against such lawsuits involving acts of torture, including rape. As I understand it, the post-Marcos Filipino government compelled the U.S. courts to accept jurisdiction in this case. Meanwhile, the Marcoses feigned ignorance, saying that they were not aware that any human rights abuses were happening. I know, I was also not shocked. The post-1986 government made sure to send evidence to refute such claims made by the Marcoses, of course. It was a long and arduous legal road that included some disappointments for the Hilao family and the others. In 1992, the Marcoses were ordered to pay $776 million in compensatory damages, in addition to $1.2 billion in exemplary damages. Since then, after fighting their own lawyer, who wanted to compromise and settle, and also fighting the Philippine Congress, the victims, including the Hilao family, have yet to see a single cent from the Marcoses. A portion of the $600 million that a Swiss bank was finally ordered to transfer from the account of the Marcoses to the Philippine National Treasury should be used to fund victims' compensation. That money is yet to be transferred to the best of my knowledge. In 1996, an appeals court in California ruled in favor of the families as well. The Marcoses were ordered to pay damages as well, but of course, no payment has even been made to this very day. The Hilao family and the other victims may have obtained that formal recognition that they needed, the legal recognition that the Marcoses were guilty of their daughter's murder and the murder and torture of so many others, but ultimately, no punishment was really dished out and justice was never served. Liliosa Hilao was supposed to graduate that year, the year she died. She was only 23, so full of life, potential, passion, and love for her country. She was never allowed to fully explore that potential. During her class's graduation, a vacant seat was reserved for her. She was awarded cum laude honors posthumously. As for Marie Hilao, years later, she would reflect on the days after Lily's abduction and her death. She said she was not able to sleep for a fortnight after Lily died. She blamed herself. She believed that if she had not escaped and jumped over the fence to run to her neighbor's house, Lily would not have been tortured. Her sadness was palpable. Of course, Lily's death was never her fault. News of Lily's death shocked a lot of Filipinos. It also shocked the country's churches so much that in 1974, an initiative was started. The churches set up the Task Force Detainees of the Philippines, which would go on to become a leading human rights organization that documented cases of human rights abuses during the martial law era. Lily's death also determined the family's life trajectory. At least in Marie's case, that is. She was a fervent and passionate advocate against the monopoly ownership of land by the wealthy. She saw the correlation between land monopolization and violence and insurgencies in the Philippines. Right till the very end, Marie stayed an advocate for the marginalized, much like her sister probably wanted to be. Marie passed away in April 2022, and the Philippines lost one of its most vocal human rights advocates, someone who was a witness to the atrocities as well as a victim after being abducted and tortured herself. Marie had surely done Lily proud, I'm sure of that. In the meantime, new generations of Filipinos are learning about Liliosa Hilao. Her name is on the Bantayog ng mga Bayani Wall of Remembrance, and in her native Sorsogon, in Bulan, a street was named after her. Here's to hoping that as we enter another Marcos presidency, her legacy will not be forgotten, much like the legacy of the next young person I will be talking about in this episode. Not much is known about Archimedes Trajano before his 21st year on this planet back in 1977. In fact, even after he died, no one knew about him and his plight until years later. The Marcos regime had their tight grip on the press, and news items that portrayed the administration in a negative light were suppressed at all costs. One journalist remembered that back then, when some anti-Marcos journalists managed to publish their work for people to read, the late dictator eventually coined the term mosquito press, persistent and annoying. So, Archimedes Trajano's story in a way became a casualty of the suppression of the press back during the martial law era. However, we have the fortune and privilege to know more than what people knew back then, and this is what we know now. It was the 31st of August, 1977, and 21-year-old Archimedes Trajano, a student at the Mapua Institute of Technology, attended an open forum held at the Pamantasan ng Lungsod ng Maynila, the same university Liliosa Hilao attended some 4 years ago before her death. In this open forum, Imee Marcos, the eldest daughter of then-President and dictator Marcos, was invited as a speaker. At that time, she was the national chairman of the Kabataang Barangay, or the National Youth Council. Archimedes, a student activist himself, most probably saw an opportunity to shine a light on a very obvious problem. So he asked a simple question and followed it up with an observation or two. He asked, "Must the Kabataang Barangay be headed by the president's daughter?" He then remarked, "She would not have gotten the position if she weren't the daughter of the president." Well, he hit a nerve or two with this remark. Imee Marcos was not happy with the question and the remark made by the young student who was around the same age as her. She appeared irritated. After Trajano said his piece, people at the forum witnessed how he was seized and then dragged away without his consent by Imee's bodyguards. Little did the audience at that open forum know that they were some of the last people to see Trajano alive. Trajano was missing for almost 2 days. On the 2nd of September 1977, Archimedes Trajano was found dead on some street in Manila. He showed very obvious signs of heavy beating and torture. The infamous black and white photos we now know of Trajano probably do not do justice to the real sight that greeted those who found the young student. His face was badly mangled and his body was bruised to no end. His mother, Agapita Trajano, would later recount that when she was allowed to finally see her son at the morgue, he was covered with a white sheet on a table. She said, quote, "When I opened the sheet, I saw him blue-black. I could not talk. Nothing. But I think my heart hardened. I said, 'My God, why him?'" End of quote. The official story that was given to Trajano's parents right after he was found was that he died as a result of a fight that Trajano had with his dorm mates. The true story would later be revealed to those closest to the Trajanos, but as I said earlier, the public would not learn about Trajano's fate until years later. It was clear that Archimedes endured prolonged beating and torture at the hands of Imee's bodyguards. If it were any other time in Filipino history, the Trajanos could have easily brought a case against those bodyguards, who in a lot of sources I have read were described as military bodyguards specifically. But the Philippines was under martial law, and a case involving the military bodyguards assigned to Imee would inevitably implicate her too, and by association, her father as well. So that was quite impossible then. Agapita Trajano, Archimedes' mother, had to bide her time. Much like the Hilao case, it was only after 1986 that Agapita was finally able to take action. By then, the Marcoses and also Fabian Ver had fled to Hawaii, but Agapita had also officially listed Hawaii as her new residence. She was ready to bring the matter of her son's death to a U.S. court. In civil court, Agapita filed a lawsuit accusing the Marcoses and Ver of false imprisonment, kidnapping, wrongful death, and deprivation of rights of her son, Archimedes. Since these were brought to a civil court, they are not called crimes, but instead are called torts or tortious acts. Now, I will spare you the legalese involved not only in the Hawaiian case, but also in the Filipino case later, even though my geeky legal mind was very much enthralled by reading pages of case law. And I mean that seriously, by the way, not sarcastically. Anyway, what you need to know is that Aimee argued and in a way also revealed three things. Firstly, she did not believe that the U.S. court in Hawaii had jurisdiction to hear this case, let alone award any damages in the case of a win for Agapita. Secondly, she essentially admitted that, yes, Archimedes was tortured and killed by her military bodyguards. Lastly, she admitted knowing all about the torture at that time. The reason Aimee was confident in admitting these things was that she thought she had sovereign immunity as a government agent. Sovereign immunity, simply put, is a concept in law in which a state head and its agents cannot commit a legal wrong and is immune from civil suit or criminal prosecution. However, this is not a blanket immunity. Different countries may interpret and put limitations on their understanding of this legal concept. Furthermore, international law also has its exceptions to the immunity rule. The only problem for Aimee was that the court disagreed with her. The court found that she was not immune, and Agapita's lawsuit, by virtue of international law, can be heard in a U.S. court. The court in Hawaii ruled for Agapita Trajano and ordered Aimee Marcos to pay the estate of Archimedes Trajano a total of $4.16 million in damages and lawyer fees. The next step in this process was to get a Filipino court to enforce the judgment from the court in Hawaii. In order to do that, Agapita Trajano needed to file a civil case in the Philippines. She did so at the Pasig Regional Trial Court since at that time in 1991, it was believed that Aimee Marcos was living in a condo unit in Pasig. This information is important, so make a note of that. The Regional Trial Court in Pasig then issued a summons for Aimee Marcos to appear in civil court because the only way the local court would acquire jurisdiction over Aimee would be through serving her a summons or through her voluntary appearance in court. The latter obviously could be disregarded given the circumstances. And so the summons was served, but it was served to a person at the condominium complex who was later identified as a caretaker. As a result, Aimee, she ignored the summons, forcing the judge to declare her in default and in favor of Agapita. So why did she ignore the summons? Aimee Marcos argued that she was already a resident of Singapore and the condominium in Pasig was not her dwelling residence or regular place of business as defined by the rules of court, and the person who received the summons, the caretaker, was neither a representative nor a resident of the place. According to her, she only ever visited the Pasig condo twice. Now, obviously, both the Trajano and Marcos sides presented evidence that Aimee was or was not a resident of Pasig, respectively. The Regional Trial Court, as we know, did not accept Aimee's arguments at all. And so, she appealed. Aimee Marcos appealed the Pasig Court's decision at the Court of Appeals, who in 1997 upheld the trial court's decision. Aimee did not back down, so her next stop was the Supreme Court. There, she finally succeeded in 2006. The ruling in her favor was penned by retired Justice Presbitero Velasco Jr. with concurrences from retired Justices Leonardo Quisumbing, Conchita Carpio Morales, and Senior Associate Justice Antonio Carpio. I will say something briefly later about Justice Presbitero Velasco Jr., so please keep him in mind for now. According to the Supreme Court, whether Aimee Marcos's real place of residence was the Pasig condo or not was not an issue anymore. For the justices back then, the main issue was the summons service. In layman's terms, because the summons was not served or delivered to Aimee in accordance with the corresponding rules of court, the whole case that was presented in front of the regional trial court in Pasig must be annulled. According to the rules of court, summons should preferably be served personally on the defendant. A summons can be served on someone else, aka a substitute, if the reasons for doing so are acceptable. The law or this rule is not perfect, though. The rule in this case does not give a clear definition, for example, of how many times a sheriff should try to deliver the summons to a defendant before finally resorting to a substitute person. So, this causes legal uncertainty, and the courts can arbitrarily decide what they find acceptable or not on a case-to-case basis, potentially causing confusion and unfairness. The sheriff, or the person who tried to deliver the summons to Aimee Marcos, testified that he tried on so many occasions to deliver the summons to Aimee herself, but she was almost never in. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court thought that the sheriff did not have enough acceptable reason to not deliver the summons to Aimee herself. Like I said, on a technicality, the Supreme Court reversed both the Court of Appeals and the Regional Trial Court's decision and allowed Aimee Marcos to ignore the Hawaii ruling, leaving the Trajanos without compensation for the brutal killing of Archimedes Trajano. Years later, in an interview, Aimee feigned ignorance. Well, she downright lied about not being aware of Trajano. She said linking her to his death was unfair and that she was mystified, seeing as, according to her, she was only 15 or 16 years old and was not even in the Philippines back then when it happened. As we now know, these are all lies. She was 22 at that point, and she was definitely in the Philippines. Now, back to the Supreme Court case. The leading justice who penned the decision was, as I mentioned, retired Justice Presbitero Velasco Jr. If you think his name sounds familiar, then you would be surprised, or maybe not surprised, to know that he had been in the news a couple of years ago due to another Marcos-related issue. That issue was the burial of former dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr. at the Libingan ng mga Bayani, or the Cemetery for Heroes. Filipinos have long fought the notion of allowing the former dictator to be buried there because, obviously, he is the farthest from what a hero is. But the Marcoses were fervent and consistent in their fight to make this happen. When Duterte became president, the Marcoses found in him an ally because the former Davao City mayor and soon-to-be former Philippine president had and still has a soft spot for the dictator's family. In August 2016, a few months after being sworn in as the new president, Duterte ordered the burial of Marcos at the Libingan ng mga Bayani for the sole reason that Marcos was a former president and a soldier, saying that these were reasons enough. Soon enough, there was a petition that reached the Supreme Court. The crux of the petition was that Duterte abused his presidential discretion when he decided to allow the burial of Marcos at the Cemetery for Heroes. Now, the Supreme Court did not decide on whether it was legal or not legal to bury the former dictator there. I think people get this confused quite often. It must be said that the question of whether he should be buried there was more of a political one and not a legal question that the justices at the Supreme Court, and they said as much. But that did not prevent, of course, Justice Presbitero and 8 other justices from ruling in favor of Duterte's decisions. The leading dissenting opinion was from Justice Maria Lourdes Sereno, who, amongst other things, stated that the Filipino government has an obligation to provide monetary and non-monetary compensation for the victims of human rights abuses during the martial law era. Non-monetary compensation, according to her, included symbolic reparation, and burying the former dictator would run contrary to such reparation. Burying him at the libingan ng mga bayani would be endorsing impunity. Justice Carpio even argued that the very fact that Marcos was ousted after the EDSA revolution disqualified him from being buried at the highly regarded cemetery. But those were the dissenting opinions, and in the end, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Duterte's decisions. And so, as a result, the former dictator's remains were airlifted from Ilocos Norte on the 18th of November 2016, and he was buried that same afternoon at the libingan ng mga bayani, adding yet another insult to the horrible injuries and deaths of the many victims of human rights atrocities under the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos Sr. Amongst the many victims were, of course, Archimedes and Liliosa, 2 young lives who were taken too soon and very brutally. 2 individuals who saw the wrongs of a corrupt government and stood up to that same power. 2 heroic Filipinos who spoke truth to power and paid dearly for it. Now, it may seem that with every attempt to hold the Marcoses accountable for both their deaths, the Marcoses managed to elude said accountability. But I want to see this picture this way. Archimedes and Liliosa stand for the kind of people in every generation who will not fear standing up for what they believe in, for truth and for integrity. So whilst we might feel frustrated that Archimedes and Liliosa never got the justice they deserve, you now have the chance to tell others about them in the hope to inspire others to speak truth to power as well, especially at this very moment. Lagim fam, thank you for listening to the second installment of my martial law series here at Lagim Podcast. I hope you liked the slight change in plans and make sure to suggest a martial law case for the next episode. I also want to express my greatest thanks to the immensely talented and kind Tanya Manalang, who lent her voice to Marie Hilao's words in this episode. If you want to follow Tanya on Instagram or TikTok, make sure to check the links in the show notes. As always, if you found this episode interesting and valuable, make sure to follow Lagim on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. On Spotify, you can rate us, whilst on Apple Podcasts, you can rate and review us. I hope you give Lagim some amazing 5-star ratings and some kind reviews, as that really helps with my reach and discoverability. If you want to support the podcast, you can always subscribe to my Patreon or make a one-off donation through buymecoffee.com. Or you can use the affiliate links in the show notes, or you can do all 3 if you fancy it. Either way, I'm very grateful. Thank you so much for your continued support and for listening. Until next time, maraming salamat at mabuhay.